January 17, 1945, Northern Apennines, Italy. The stone farmhouse sits half-collapsed against the mountainside, its roof tiles scattered like broken teeth across the frozen ground. Inside, in what remains of a kitchen that once smelled of bread and olive oil, 4 women crouch in the darkness. Their breath rises in clouds. Their fingers, raw from the cold and from handling weapons they learned to use only months ago, tremble as they wrap cloth around the barrel of a stolen German rifle. Outside, the wind carries the distant percussion of artillery, a sound so constant now it has become part of the landscape itself, like the cry of birds or the rush of water over stone. These are not the women their mothers raised them to be, not the daughters who learned to embroider, who went to mass, who understood that their voices should never rise above the gentle murmur expected in a world designed by men. They are partisans now, partigiane. The word itself still feels foreign in their mouths, sharp-edged and unforgiving. Maria, the eldest at 23, was a schoolteacher. Julia worked in her father's bakery. Anna and Francesca, barely 18, had never travelled beyond the valley where they were born. Now they carry guns. Now they plant explosives beneath railway tracks. Now they kill. But killing, they have discovered, is only half the war. In the corner, Giuseppe lies on a table that once held Sunday dinners. He is 17. The bullet entered below his ribs 3 hours ago, and the cloth they pressed against the wound has turned from white to red to something darker, something that speaks of time running out. They do not know what to do. They know how to shoot, how to hide, how to run through forests in the night with their lungs burning and their hearts hammering against their ribs. But they do not know this. They do not know how to reach inside a human body and pull a boy back from the edge of everything ending. Maria's hands hover over Giuseppe's torso, shaking. She has read about battlefield medicine in pamphlets dropped by Allied planes, in smuggled copies of medical texts from the university in Bologna. But reading and doing are separated by a chasm as wide as the one between girlhood and this, whatever this has become. The boy's breathing grows shallow. His lips have gone the colour of ash. This is what the German occupation did not prepare them for. This is the education Mussolini's Italy never offered its daughters. They learned to support men, to nurture them, to stand behind them in photographs and at altars. But to save them? To split open their bodies and understand the machinery of blood and bone and breath? This was never part of the design. The war came to Italy not as a sudden thunderclap, but as a slow suffocation. After Mussolini's fall in July 1943, after the armistice with the Allies in September of that same year, after the German Wehrmacht poured south across the Alps to occupy the northern regions, the country found itself caught between collapsing empires. The Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state propped up by Nazi Germany, controlled the north. The Allies pushed slowly, painfully up from the south. And in between, in the mountains and valleys and ancient hill towns, the resistance grew like mushrooms after rain, sudden, stubborn, everywhere at once. Women joined the partisan brigades in numbers that surprised even the men who led them. By 1945, over 35,000 women would serve in active combat roles. Another 40,000 would provide support: couriers, spies, medics, suppliers. These were not the women of propaganda posters, the dutiful mothers and faithful wives. These were women who had watched their brothers dragged off to German labour camps, their fathers executed in town squares, their homes ransacked by fascist militia. These were women who had learned that waiting to be saved was another form of dying. But the partisan movement, born from desperation and rage, was never a professional army. It was farmers and factory workers, students and shopkeepers, armed with whatever weapons they could steal or smuggle. They learned tactics through trial and catastrophic error. They lost people, so many people, to mistakes that training might have prevented. A mishandled grenade, an infection from a minor wound, blood loss from injuries that with knowledge, with skill, might have been survivable. The women especially felt the weight of their unpreparedness. Many had been thrust into medical roles by simple default. They were women, therefore they must know how to care for the wounded. But folk remedies and motherly instincts could not extract bullets or treat shock or recognize the signs of internal hemorrhaging. They watched men die from wounds that seemed small, watched boys bleed out while they stood by helpless, their hands stained red with blood and with failure. What they needed, what the entire partisan movement needed, was knowledge. Not just weapons or supplies, but the understanding of how to preserve life in the midst of so much death. What they needed was someone to teach them that war is not only fought with bullets, but with competence, with precision, with the ability to keep fighting tomorrow because you learned how to save each other today. What they needed, though they did not yet know it, was already on its way. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was America's wartime intelligence agency, the precursor to the CIA, and by 1944 it had operatives scattered across occupied Europe like seeds scattered across ploughed ground. Some gathered intelligence, some organized sabotage, some worked in the shadows, building networks of resistance fighters, turning isolated cells of rebels into coordinated forces that could harry the German war machine from within. In northern Italy, OSS teams parachuted into the darkness, dropped from C-47 aircraft into drop zones marked by partisan bonfires, carrying not just weapons and radio equipment, but something else, something the Italian fighters had not expected: medical knowledge. The Americans understood what the partisans were only beginning to learn, that guerrilla warfare is a mathematics of attrition, and the side that can keep its wounded fighters alive to fight again is the side that can sustain the struggle. The OSS medical training program for partisans was not gentle, it was not theoretical. It was designed to turn civilians into combat medics in a matter of weeks, teaching them to perform procedures that in peacetime would require years of medical school. Wound debridement, hemorrhage control, the treatment of shock, the administration of morphine, the field amputation of shattered limbs. These were not skills taught in textbooks passed around a classroom. These were skills taught with real bodies, real blood, real urgency. And the Americans who taught them, many of them medics and doctors themselves, some of them nurses who had volunteered for service overseas, brought with them a quality that the Italian partisans, especially the women, had rarely encountered: the assumption of capability. The Americans did not arrive with the expectation that women could not learn, could not perform, could not excel at the brutal practicalities of combat medicine. They arrived with manuals and morphine syrettes and an attitude that said, "You need to know this, so we will teach you this, and you will learn it because lives depend on it." For the women of the resistance, this was a revolution more profound than any they had yet experienced. Lieutenant Sarah Kovacs parachuted into the Apennines on a moonless night in December 1944. She was 28 years old, a trained nurse from Pennsylvania who had volunteered for OSS service after her brother was killed at Anzio. She spoke Italian with an American accent that made the partisans smile, and she carried in her pack not just medical supplies, but a conviction that would reshape the women she trained. The conviction that medicine, like warfare, was not bound by gender. She met Maria's brigade in a barn outside Reggio Emilia, 8 women and 12 men, all of them gaunt from hunger, all of them carrying the exhaustion of a war that had already ground on for too many winters. When Kovacs announced that she would be conducting medical training for anyone who wanted to learn, she expected the men to volunteer first. She expected the women to hang back, to demur, to wait for permission. Instead, every single woman in the brigade stepped forward. Kovacs began the first lesson the next morning, in the cold stone cellar of a ruined villa, with a lecture on the human circulatory system. She drew diagrams in charcoal on the wall: heart, arteries, veins, the branching paths that carry life through the body. The women watched with an intensity that Kovacs would remember decades later, when she tried to describe this moment to her daughter. They were not just learning anatomy. They were learning that the human body, which they had been taught to see as a mystery, as something sacred and unknowable, was in fact a mechanism. Complex, yes, fragile, certainly, but understandable. And if it could be understood, it could be repaired. Maria, the former schoolteacher, took notes in a battered journal, her handwriting cramped and meticulous. Julia asked questions about blood types, about infection, about what to do when the bleeding would not stop. Anna and Francesca practiced bandaging techniques on each other, wrapping tourniquets around arms and legs, learning the precise pressure required to cut off blood flow without causing permanent damage. But it was not the diagrams or the lectures that transformed them. It was the moment, 3 days into the training, when Kovacs brought out a body. Not a human body. They did not have that luxury. But the carcass of a pig, procured from a farmer sympathetic to the resistance, a creature with anatomy close enough to human to serve the purpose. Kovacs laid the animal on a table, handed Maria a scalpel and said, "Show me where you would cut to stop bleeding from the femoral artery." Maria's hand shook. She had never held a scalpel before. She had never cut into flesh, even animal flesh, with the deliberate intention of learning. But Kovacs did not take the blade away, did not tell her it was too difficult, too complicated, too much for a woman to attempt. Instead, she said, "Take your time. Think about what you learned. Show me." Maria cut. Kovacs corrected her angle, her depth. Maria cut again, and again, until her hands stopped shaking, until the motion became familiar, until the terror of not knowing gave way to the confidence of understanding. The training continued through January, through February, through the frozen weeks when the mountains became impassable and the partisan brigades hunkered down in whatever shelters they could find. Kovacs taught them to recognize the signs of shock, the pale skin, the rapid pulse, the confusion that meant the body was beginning to shut down. She taught them to start IV lines, using tubing and needles smuggled in from Allied supply drops, finding veins in arms numbed by cold. She taught them to clean and close wounds, to debride dead tissue, to pack abdominal injuries with gauze and pressure and hope. She taught them triage. This was perhaps the hardest lesson, the brutal calculus of deciding who could be saved and who could not, of learning to walk past a dying man to treat someone whose injuries were less severe but more survivable. The Italian women resisted this at first. It felt like murder, like abandonment, like a violation of everything they had been taught about mercy and compassion. But Kovacs was firm. "You cannot save everyone," she told them, her voice steady and devoid of sentimentality. "But you can save someone. If you spend your time on the dying, the savable will die too. You have to choose." Maria hated this. She hated the cold arithmetic of it, the way it reduced human lives to probabilities and resource calculations. But she learned it. They all learned it, because the alternative was to lose everyone. And they learned something else, something that no manual could teach, something that came only from the doing. They learned confidence, not the false bravado of pretending to know more than they did, but the solid, earned assurance that comes from performing a task again and again until it becomes reflex. They learned to trust their hands, their judgment, their ability to act in moments when action was the only thing standing between life and death. The Americans brought more than just knowledge. They brought abundance. The Italian partisans, who had been living on watered-down polenta and stolen potatoes, who had not seen real coffee or chocolate or canned meat in years, were stunned by the supplies that arrived in the OSS drops. Sulfur drugs in quantities they had only dreamed of, morphine syrettes by the dozen, sterile bandages, clean gauze, surgical thread that did not fray and snap, plasma for transfusions, penicillin, miraculous penicillin, the drug that could stop infections that had once been death sentences. Julia, who had watched her younger sister die of an infected cut the year before, held a vial of penicillin in her hand and wept. Not because the drug could save her sister, that chance was long gone, but because it meant that maybe, just maybe, they could save the next girl, the next boy, the next person who would otherwise bleed out in a farmhouse while comrades who loved them stood by helpless. This was the other lesson the Americans taught, though they never spoke it aloud, that war did not have to mean deprivation, that fighting did not require accepting needless death, that a nation with resources could choose to pour those resources into saving lives as well as taking them. The German forces occupying Italy were formidable, professional, brutal, but they were also starving, exhausted, stretched thin across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. They had efficiency and discipline, but they were running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, hope. The Americans, in contrast, seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of everything. This was not just material wealth, this was a philosophical statement about what a society could be, about what it meant to fight a war while still believing that individual lives mattered enough to spend resources saving them. On March 3, 1945, Maria used her training to save a life. The firefight happened just after dawn in a valley south of Parma. The Partisan Brigade had ambushed a German supply convoy, a quick strike intended to grab food and ammunition before disappearing back into the hills. But the Germans had been expecting trouble, and they responded with machine gun fire that turned the ambush into a bloodbath. 3 partisans died in the first 30 seconds. 4 more were wounded. One of them was Paolo, a 19-year-old boy who had joined the resistance after the Germans burned his village. The bullet hit him in the thigh, tearing through the femoral artery, and the blood came out in rhythmic jets that matched his heartbeat. In the old days, the days before Sarah Kovacs, before the training, the other partisans would have tried to stop the bleeding with pressure, with cloth, with prayers. Paolo would have bled out in minutes. His death would have been mourned but accepted. One more name added to the long list of those the mountains had claimed. But Maria did not accept it. She ran through gunfire to reach him, threw herself down beside his body, and without hesitation pressed her thumb directly onto the artery above the wound. The bleeding slowed. She shouted for a tourniquet, and Anna, who had been covering the retreat with rifle fire, sprinted over with the canvas strap they all now carried. Maria wrapped it above the injury, tightened it until Paolo's leg went pale, checked his pulse. Still strong, still alive. They carried him to a safe house 3 miles away, moving through forests where the snow still clung to the shadows. Maria started an IV line in his arm, pushing plasma to replace what he had lost. She cleaned the wound, cutting away shredded fabric and dead tissue, packing it with sulfur powder to prevent infection. She monitored his blood pressure, his breathing, his level of consciousness. And when he opened his eyes 6 hours later, confused and in pain, but alive, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly, but its more durable cousin: competence. Paolo survived. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he walked. He lived to see the Germans surrender, to see Mussolini's corpse hanging upside down from a gas station roof in Milan, to see the war end and the slow, painful work of rebuilding begin. He lived because Maria had learned, because Sarah Kovacs had taught her, because the Americans had believed that even in the midst of war, even in the mountains of occupied Italy, the life of one teenage boy was worth the time and effort to save. The women of the Italian resistance did not expect to be stunned by the Americans. They expected guns, perhaps. They expected radio equipment and demolition supplies. What they did not expect was to be treated as equals in the machinery of war, to be handed scalpels and morphine syrettes and told, without condescension, without doubt, that they were capable of mastering skills that their own society had deemed beyond their reach. The OSS agents who trained them, men and women like Sarah Kovacs, like Lieutenant James Morrison, who taught field surgery, like Sergeant Margaret Chen, who specialized in trauma care, did not arrive with speeches about liberation or equality. They arrived with practical knowledge, and the assumption that anyone willing to learn could learn, regardless of gender. This was, in its own quiet way, more radical than any political manifesto. The Italian women had grown up in a culture that told them their bodies were mysteries they could not fully understand, that medicine was a male domain, that their role in war was to wait and to mourn. The Americans showed them something different. The OSS was disbanded in September 1945, its operatives scattered back to civilian life or absorbed into the new peacetime intelligence apparatus. Sarah Kovacs returned to Pennsylvania, to a nursing career, to a life that from the outside looked unremarkable. But she carried with her the memory of those women in the mountains, women who had learned faster and more thoroughly than almost any students she would ever teach again, because they understood that what they were learning was not theoretical. It was life and death. It was the difference between comrades who came home and comrades who bled out in farmhouses, mourned and forgotten. Kovacs never wrote a memoir. She never sought recognition for her work in Italy. But in a letter to a friend, written in 1972, she described the women she had trained in words that hint at the quiet pride she felt. They were not soldiers when I met them. They were not doctors. But they were brave enough to admit they did not know, and disciplined enough to learn, and strong enough to use what they learned when it mattered most. I have taught in hospitals for 30 years since the war. I have never again taught students like them. The story of the Italian partisan women and their American teachers is not one of grand battles or strategic victories. It is a story about the transfer of knowledge across cultures, across languages, across the vast gulf between those who had resources and those who had only need. It is a story about what happens when people are given tools, not just physical tools, but intellectual ones, and trusted to use them. The women did not expect to be stunned. They expected, perhaps, to be patronized, to be handed bandages and told to make do, to be treated as auxiliaries to the real work of war. Instead, they were handed scalpels. They were taught anatomy and physiology. They were given morphine and plasma and penicillin and shown how to use them. They were treated, in other words, as capable human beings in a moment when capability was the only thing that mattered. This was the gift the Americans brought, and it was more valuable than the guns and explosives and radio equipment, though those mattered too. The gift was the belief that ordinary people, given knowledge and training and trust, could rise to extraordinary demands. That a schoolteacher could learn to perform field surgery, that a baker's daughter could learn to recognize and treat shock, that girls who had never traveled beyond their valleys could become medics capable of saving lives in the chaos of combat. The Germans in their occupation had brought order and brutality. The fascists had brought rhetoric and repression. Not just weapons, though the weapons mattered, but knowledge, and with it the implicit message that they, women who had been told to be quiet, to be gentle, to wait for others to act, were worth teaching. That their hands could learn to heal as well as to fight, that their minds could master complexity, that they, like anyone, could be trained to excellence if someone believed in them enough to try. In the end, combat medicine is about defiance. It is about looking at a wounded body and refusing to accept that death is inevitable. It is about imposing will and skill and knowledge on chaos, about saying that even here, even now, even in the midst of war, we will not surrender to entropy. We will fight for every life. We will learn what we need to learn, do what we need to do, become what we need to become. The Italian women learned this from the Americans. They learned that abundance is not just material but intellectual, that freedom is not just political but personal, that democracy lives not only in constitutions, but in the moment when someone hands you a tool you have never held and says, with absolute confidence, that you will learn to use it well. They were stunned, and then they learned, and then they saved lives. And that, more than any battle, more than any declaration or treaty or surrender, is what victory looks like when you look close enough to see it.